After being separated from Qin Mu, Pangong So was furious because he believed Qin Mu had deceived him. Qin Mu had deliberately closed the door to a mysterious room while entering it, using the ship's spell of space integration to prevent Pangong So from following. Pangong So angrily accused Qin Mu of breaking their agreement to cooperate and immediately began calculating the second layer of the spell of space integration. Since he now knew there was another layer of space, he believed he could locate the long corridor himself and prevent Qin Mu from monopolizing its secrets. Pangong So opened room after room to search for his subordinates, who had become lost inside the enormous treasured ship and were moving deeper into it instead of finding an exit. Along the way, he encountered the two bats and the dragon Qilin, who was also calculating the spell of space integration and had nearly discovered the location of the bridge. The two sides fought fiercely, and Pangong So and his companions suffered a heavy defeat. Fortunately, a shaman king suddenly entered the room and rescued them. After finding the other shaman kings, Pangong So still could not locate the long corridor. He decided that it did not matter because Qin Mu would eventually return. At which point he intended to capture Qin Mu, force him to hand over the silver helmet, and reveal all the secrets. Meanwhile, Qin Mu had deliberately left Pangong So behind because the old man had already helped him discover the ship's secrets. And Qin Mu no longer needed him once the danger had diminished. He regarded their alliance as a way to have Pangong So bear the dangers for him. Qin Mu then entered an enormous room nearly 10 miles wide, resembling the Bent Mountain Shrine he had previously seen underwater. The room was smaller than Bent Mountain Shrine but contained an enormous warped space that was even larger than the treasured ship itself. Its ceiling was formed from long pieces of wood, unlike Bent Mountain Shrine's ceiling, which had been constructed from the bones of a Teoti divine beast. Qin Mu realized that the space here had been created through powerful divine arts and the distortion of space, making it much more difficult to construct. At the center of the room stood an incomparably huge ancient tree reaching into the sky. Its roots twisted across the ground like dragons, while glowing light flowed from its roots through its trunk and upward, illuminating the entire room. Rune-like markings moved beneath the bark and flowed toward the sky and surrounding walls before entering the body of the treasured ship. After some time, the tree produced a deafening heartbeat. Qin Mu realized that the treasured ship had been constructed around this enormous ancient tree and that the wooden pieces above were likely its branches. The ancient tree was still alive and served as the core and source of power of the treasured ship, providing the strength needed to move it and sustain its long journey. Qin Mu therefore understood that the bridge and silver helmet were not the true means of controlling the treasured ship. The old man from the painting appeared on the bright, mirror-like floor and waved at Qin Mu before running toward the ancient tree. Qin Mu followed him while wondering about the old man's origin. He realized that the old man seemed more complete and lifelike than Grandpa Def's living paintings. Def's paintings could bestow a divine soul through mutual sensitivity, but their living forms could not last long before turning back into ink. The old man, however, seemed almost indistinguishable from an ordinary living being except for his ability to pass through walls. Qin Mu concluded that the person who created him might not have surpassed Def in the painting path, but had instead surpassed him in the path of creation, using creation to give the painted old man true life so that he could serve as a secret guardian and guide. As Qin Mu followed the old man toward the ancient tree, he noticed increasing amounts of green, sticky liquid covering the floor. The old man also became more cautious and carefully avoided it. Qin Mu recognized the liquid from the deck of the ship, where it had appeared during the invasion of terrifying devil Qi containing a frightening entity. He had also seen the same liquid in the room before entering the long corridor. Since it was now concentrated around the ancient tree, Qin Mu realized that the tree was extremely important to the owner of the liquid. The more he examined the surroundings, the more he felt that this enormous room was actually a nest belonging to the mysterious creature. At the bottom of the ancient tree, Qin Mu finally saw the man in white from the illusion. More precisely, he saw only the man's face. The owner of the treasured ship, the man in white surnamed Qin who had come from Carefree Village, had completely merged with the ancient tree. Only part of his face remained visible, while the rest of his body had become one with the tree. His eyes were lifeless, and the heartbeat Qin Mu had heard earlier was apparently the man's extremely slow heartbeat. Qin Mu realized that the man had used a unique forbidden method to extend his life by merging himself with the ancient tree and linking their lives. However, The price was enormous. His body had become part of the tree, leaving him unable to move and causing him to gradually transform into a tree. His injuries must have been so severe that he could no longer survive normally. After being pursued by his enemies to this place, he had eliminated them but had ultimately been forced to use a forbidden technique and merge with the ancient tree in order to continue living. When Qin Mu approached, the man in white slowly opened his eyes. They looked like eyeballs carved from wood and could barely see the figure before him. Qin Mu asked whether the man had been the one who sent the old man from the painting to guide him there. Feeling an indescribable familiarity and connection with him, Qin Mu then asked whether he was Qin Fengqing and whether he had come from Carefree Village. The man in the tree seemed to recognize Qin Mu and became excited. But his tongue had already turned into wood, preventing him from speaking. Qin Mu realized that the forbidden technique had preserved his life while destroying most of his senses and bodily functions. Qin Mu then took out the jade pendant that had been found inside his swaddle and asked whether the man recognized it and whether the Qin character on it was the Qin character of Carefree Village. The man became even more agitated, causing the ancient tree to tremble as he struggled to free himself and reach for the jade pendant. Rings of light flowed down the tree trunk and suppressed his movements. He opened his mouth repeatedly as though he had countless things he wanted to tell Qin Mu. But he could not produce any sound. Qin Mu became lost in thought and began speaking about his own origins. Granny had told him that the corpse of a woman carrying a basket had sent him into disabled elderly village in the great ruins. Qin Mu had later encountered her beneath the river but had never been able to see her clearly. The only thing connecting him to his origins was the jade pendant he had worn since childhood. He had always hoped to discover where he came from and whether his family was still alive. Qin Mu sat beneath the tree, holding his knees while the jade pendant dangled from his fingertip. He said that he believed his parents might still be alive and waiting for him to find them. Even though he had never met them, a little girl who had become a sun guardian had told him that he might be from Carefree Village. So he had tried desperately to reach it. He had searched for information about Carefree Village and looked for the path leading there. But he had repeatedly failed. His efforts had even implicated village chief and the others, nearly causing all of them to die because of him. This time, Qin Mu had deliberately not told them about this place because he was afraid of implicating them again. He addressed the man as Qin Fengqing and said that although he had finally found him, he had never expected that Qin Fengqing would be unable to tell him anything. Qin Mu lamented that it was so difficult for him to return home and learn about his own birth. Qin Mu buried his face in his arms and fell silent. Tears began to fall. When he raised his head and wiped his eyes, he saw that tears were also rolling down the cheeks of the man merged with the tree. Suddenly, something began moving within the tree above them. It slithered downward and coiled around the trunk like an enormous snake. A strange and cryptic voice emerged from it, addressing Qin Mu as Qin Hanzhen and stating that now that he had met Qin Fengqing, his wish should have been fulfilled. Qin Mu's thoughts fell into complete disorder when he connected the words in the family register with what the strange life form had said. The family register he had found in the study room recorded the descendants of founding emperor's bloodline. And on its final page was written, 107th generation, son of Hanzhen, Fengqing. This meant that Qin Hanzhen was his father and Qin Fengqing was himself. The man who had merged with the ancient divine tree was therefore his biological father. The closest kin he had never met and had longed for every day. Qin Mu trembled and became pale as he struggled to accept this revelation and wondered why his father had ended up in such a miserable state. He repeatedly reminded himself of old Ma's teachings, no matter what danger he faced. He must never lose his composure, because even in a situation that seemed certain to end in death, remaining calm could allow him to find a way to survive. Cripple had also taught him to maintain a smile and remain positive. Not only to deceive enemies but also to keep his own spirit from collapsing. While Granny C had warned him that even if darkness or a devil occupied his heart, he must remain strong, because once his mind became confused, everything would be over. Yet when Qin Mu saw his father, the closest kin he had never known, reduced to this state, he could not follow any of those teachings. He tried to suppress his emotions and stop thinking about the man in the tree. But his body continued to tremble. He eventually realized that he had unconsciously clenched his fists so tightly that his fingernails had pierced his palms and drawn blood. Qin Mu then raised his head and carefully observed the mysterious creature slithering down from the tree. Her enormous body was half snake and half human. Her lower body was that of a giant snake without scales, while her upper body belonged to an extremely beautiful and alluring woman. Yet the voice coming from her was unmistakably male. Her body continuously left behind a trail of sticky liquid, and her appearance resembled Qin Emu's Saturn sovereign transformation, except that her form was much more primitive. It did not seem to be a form she had cultivated but rather the natural form in which she had been born. 2 flesh membranes grew from the back of her neck. Whenever she spoke, these membranes opened like 2 fans, extending past her head and trembling continuously to produce her voice. She seemed unable to speak normally through her mouth and instead relied on the vibration of these membranes to create sound, making her voice strange and obscure. Long bone spikes, about 2 feet in length and resembling javelins, grew from the ends of the membranes. When the membranes opened, black pictures resembling eyeballs appeared on them, giving the impression of 2 bizarre eyes. Qin Mu knew that Saturn's sovereign possessed 2 known forms. One was the ordinary form without the gate of heaven influence or the scripture in hand, while his own transformation included the gate of heaven influence behind him and a scripture in his hand. However, the creature before him possessed an even more primitive form. Qin Mu realized that she was likely an ancient life form of Yudu and might even be a god. She was also different from the mysterious owner of the eyes located 900 yards away. The strange life form then reminded Qin Hanzhen of their agreement. She said that they had made the Pact of Earth Count, under which Qin Hanzhen had promised that once he found his son Qin Fengqing, he would abandon everything, follow her to Yudu, and hand over the location of Carefree Village. Since he had finally found his son, the condition had now been fulfilled and it was time for him to honor his promise. Qin Hanzhen remained motionless because his physical body had already completely transformed into wood. His eyes could barely distinguish Qin Emu's appearance, yet tears continued to flow from them. Saturn's sovereign explained that when Qin Hanzhen had entered Yudu and broken through its sealing barrier, he had been left with only his final breath. He had merged with the divine tree because he wanted to preserve his life long enough to meet his son. She had remained beside him during this period, and Qin Hanzhen had eventually promised that after meeting Qin Fengqing, he would let go of everything, whether it was his own life or Carefree Village. He would even surrender his soul to Earth Count and reveal the location of Carefree Village. Because she had agreed to these terms, Saturn's sovereign had not taken his life before he could meet Qin Mu. She then threatened Qin Mu and Qin Hanzhen, suggesting that Qin Hanzhen might now regret his promise after finally seeing his son. She asked whether he wanted to watch his young son die in front of him, deliberately describing Qin Emu's 16-year-old body as tender and full of life. Faced with this threat, Qin Mu immediately activated the Overlord Body 3 elixir technique and used Saturn Sovereign's Earth Marquee True technique to transform into Saturn Sovereign's form. He tried to speak to her, but Saturn Sovereign immediately recognized what he was doing. She stretched out her enormous snake body and moved away from the divine tree, although her long tail remained wrapped around it. Looking down at Qin Emu's transformed body, she mocked him for displaying such an immature imitation in front of her. She revealed that Saturn Sovereign's form itself was merely an imitation of her true appearance because she was the real Saturn Sovereign. She deliberately approached Qin Mu and expected to see fear, uneasiness, and despair on his face after his understanding of the situation had been overturned. Although Qin Mu tried desperately to remain calm, Saturn Sovereign still detected the fear hidden deep inside him. She was pleased by this and mocked him for always trying to behave like an adult despite still being a young and inexperienced person. She also revealed that she knew Qin Mu had used the Yudu phrase, Gate of Heaven influence, when he boarded the ship. Qin Mu had apparently believed that knowing this phrase would frighten her into retreating and allow him to board safely. But Saturn Sovereign had never been intimidated by it. Qin Mu realized that before a true god like Saturn Sovereign, all of his schemes and calculations were meaningless. He had always imitated the adults of disabled elderly village, learning from the way they handled danger and forcing himself to become someone capable of shouldering responsibility. But beneath that appearance he was still a young man. In front of Saturn Sovereign, his knowledge, hard work, and attempts at maturity appeared childish. Saturn Sovereign then returned to the divine tree and wrapped her tail around it like a woman clinging to the man she loved. She mocked Qin Hanzhen for being sorrowful despite finally reuniting with his son. She pointed out that the reason for his sorrow was that this reunion would also become their final separation. From then on, father and son would be divided forever, with one living and the other dying. She told Qin Hanzhen that if he revealed the location of Carefree Village, all of his children and clansmen could go to Yudu and accompany him. She ridiculed him for believing that a mortal could bargain with a god and obtain a favorable deal. In reality, the only bargaining chip she had offered was his life. She had used Qin Hanzhen's life to exchange for the lives of everyone in Carefree Village and for Qin Emu's life, while Qin Hanzhen had received only the opportunity to meet his son briefly. Saturn's sovereign considered this proof that Qin Hanzhen had allowed his emotions to make him foolish. Even though he had cultivated the power of gods and devils, he remained bound by mortal emotions and therefore could never attain the mentality of a true god. More importantly, the Pact of Earth Count bound him to his oath, making it impossible for him to simply go back on his word. Qin Hanzhen regained his composure and attempted to speak, but his tongue had already transformed into wood, preventing him from producing any sound. Saturn's sovereign repeatedly moved closer and asked what he was trying to say. But Qin Hanzhen could only move his mouth silently. At that moment, Qin Emu's mental state suddenly became calm. He told Saturn's sovereign that because father and son were connected in heart and intention, he believed he could understand what Qin Hanzhen wanted to say. Qin Mu pointed out that both his and his father's lives were already completely controlled by Saturn's sovereign, so there was no reason for them to attempt any tricks. Saturn's sovereign accepted this and allowed Qin Mu to approach his father and listen. Qin Mu came directly before the man in the tree, tilted his head, and listened carefully before telling Saturn's sovereign that Qin Hanzhen was saying his eyes were almost blind and he could no longer see Qin Emu's face clearly. Therefore, according to the conditions of the Pact of Earth Count, he had technically not truly seen his son, meaning that the pact had not yet been activated. Saturn's sovereign was surprised and amused that the father and son had truly understood each other without speaking. She then explained the forbidden technique Qin Hanzhen had used. It was called Spring Comes Upon a Withered Tree, a forbidden art that allowed him to merge with the divine tree and borrow life force from other beings to prolong his own existence. However, the technique had an extremely serious drawback. The connection affected not only their lives but also their physical bodies. When Qin Hanzhen had fought those gods, he had exhausted them to death, but in doing so he had also exhausted his own life force. He had therefore been forced to use the forbidden technique to extend his life and preserve himself until he could meet Qin Mu. By then, almost his entire body had become wood, and only his face had not completely transformed. Normally, reversing such a process would have been extremely difficult, but Saturn's sovereign claimed that she was capable of doing it because she originated from Yudu and possessed authority over life itself. She opened the flesh membranes behind her head, revealing the strange black eye-like patterns. 2 beams of light shot from them and struck Qin Hanzhen's body. Under the power of Saturn's sovereign, the wooden surface covering his body gradually began to peel away, while the lines on the skin of his neck slowly change, no longer resembling the grain of an ancient tree. Qin Mu used the beams from the eye images behind Saturn's sovereign's head to suppress the wooden nature within the man in the divine tree, allowing his eyes to regain some ability to see. Saturn's sovereign deliberately kept most of the forbidden technique intact because she knew Qin Hanzhen was extremely powerful and had been comparable to her at her peak. Qin Hanzhen could not speak, but Qin Mu listened carefully and understood his meaning. Qin Mu explained that Saturn's sovereign had misunderstood Qin Hanzhen's intention. He had not agreed to see Qin Mu and fulfill the Pact of Earth Count. He was willing never to see his son if necessary. His real purpose was to have Saturn's sovereign suppress part of the wooden nature in his body so that he could regain some mobility. Saturn's sovereign mocked Qin Mu, arguing that even if Qin Hanzhen recovered some movement, his divine sword was already broken and he could not defeat her with only a small portion of his body. Qin Mu replied that his father still had the ability to resist because he had brought him his sword. At that moment, Carefree's sword broke through its wooden sheath, and a huge wooden hand emerged from the divine tree. Brilliant sword light instantly filled the entire hall. The sword released tremendous power and displayed a sword path that Qin Mu could barely comprehend. Within the sword light, he no longer saw merely a weapon, but the joys and sorrows, separations and reunions, lifelong pursuits, and unwavering will of a person. The sword and the Tao had completely fused into one, surpassing even legendary sword arts such as Village Chief's sword picture and the Tao sect's Tao sword. Saturn's sovereign was shocked by the sword's power. Qin Mu felt her overwhelming divine might and saw a gigantic orange-yellow star that seemed capable of crushing everything. With Saturn Sovereign standing before it, his eyes began to burn, forcing him to close them. The divine power rapidly weakened, and Saturn Sovereign fled from the room. She declared that she would definitely return to find Qin Hanzhen and Qin Fengqing. The treasured ship shook violently, confirming that she had escaped. When Qin Mu opened his eyes again, the sword light had disappeared. Carefree sword was embedded in the ground before him, its hilt still vibrating, while a pool of god blood beneath it emitted dazzling multicolored divine light. The wooden nature on Qin Hanzhen's face gradually faded, but he continued keeping his eyes tightly shut. If he opened them, the Pact of Earth Count would be activated. Earth Count would seize his soul, and Carefree Village would be exposed, causing his relatives to die. Qin Mu then asked whether his real name was Qin Fengqing. He explained that village chief had given him the name Qin Mu, the Qin surnamed cowherd boy, and that he had only now learned his parents had already named him Fengqing. He asked whether the man in the tree was his father. Qin Hanzhen did not open his eyes, but a branch grew from the tree, produced a tender leaf, and gently stroked Qin Mu's head. Qin Mu was overwhelmed by emotion because no one had ever treated him in such a way. Apothecary had never shown him this kind of affection. Blind rarely praised him. Granny C had only praised him after he grew older and helped with chores. Old Ma was stern because Qin Mu reminded him of his deceased children. Deaf often found him troublesome. Mute constantly played tricks on him. Crippled treated him like a partner in his childish schemes. And village chief, despite smiling often, carried many burdens in his heart. No one had ever gently touched Qin Mu's head before. Qin Mu looked upward to keep his tears from obscuring his vision. Although he had always tried to behave like an adult by learning from the elders of disabled elderly village, at that moment he felt like a child who should have been accustomed to staying beside his parents. Leaning against the divine tree, he felt an unprecedented peace and security, as though he had returned to the safe harbor of home. The old man from the painting appeared, looked around, and secretly entered the tree. Soon, Qin Hanzhen spoke with great difficulty, repeating, "You are very good." It was seemingly the only praise he knew how to give because he had never praised a child before. Qin Mu understood that his father was praising him for understanding his intentions. Although Qin Hanzhen could barely move or speak, Qin Mu had deliberately lured Saturn Sovereign into suppressing part of his wooden nature, giving him the opportunity to regain his power. Qin Mu then leaned toward him and created an opportunity for Qin Hanzhen to seize Carefree sword. While his words disrupted Saturn Sovereign's state of mind and created the opening for the sword strike, Qin Mu told Qin Hanzhen that they were father and son and that, despite never having met before, he felt they were similar in certain ways. He also said that he had previously made the Pact of Earth Count with others and understood its tricks. Qin Hanzhen acknowledged him. Qin Mu then rested against the tree and enjoyed the rare tranquility. After a long time, a flower bloomed on the tree and produced a fruit, which fell into Qin Mu's hand. Its fragrance reminded him of the way parents worried about whether their children had enough food and warmth. Qin Mu asked where his mother had gone, whether she was still alive, and said that he would go find her. Qin Hanzhen answered with difficulty that she had brought Qin Mu and the clansmen to Yudu. Qin Mu was stunned because Granny C had found him beside the surging river outside disabled elderly village in the Great Ruins rather than in Yudu. He therefore wondered how he had eventually reached the Great Ruins and what had happened at that time. Qin Mu then asked how he could return to Carefree Village. Qin Hanzhen told him that Elder Painting would bring him to the study room, where something he had left for Qin Mu was waiting. He then told Qin Mu to leave because they would never meet again. Qin Mu's heart tightened at these words. Elder Painting signaled for him to pull out Carefree sword. Qin Mu composed himself, removed the sword from the ground, and followed Elder Painting. Before leaving, Qin Mu looked back, but Qin Hanzhen still kept his eyes closed. Qin Mu realized that Elder Painting must have some connection with his father, perhaps even receiving life from him. Although he did not know the exact relationship, Qin Mu loudly asked whether father and son truly could never meet again. Qin Hanzhen answered, "No." Qin Mu then declared that he would save him and shouted that Earth Count was nothing to fear and that he would eliminate Earth Count, telling his father to wait for him. The divine tree remained motionless. After Qin Mu left, Qin Hanzhen slowly opened his eyes, and tears rolled down his face. He heard Qin Mu's footsteps outside the room and heard him quietly ask Elder Painting to take care of his father after he left. In the study room of the treasured ship, Elder Painting led Qin Mu to the bookshelf. But all the books had already been taken, leaving the shelves empty. Qin Mu became furious and suspected that Pangong So had come to rob his belongings. Suddenly, Elder Painting entered a painting and waved to Qin Mu from within. Qin Mu hesitated before approaching. To his astonishment, he discovered that he could actually enter the painting and become a man within it. Inside the painting, a man dressed in white was standing as if waiting for him.